Thanks, Peter. Hi, my name is Sanders Kleinfeld. I'm Director of Publishing Technology at O'Reilly Media. And I'm here today to talk about the Ebook Avant-Garde. So I'm going to be splitting this presentation up into two parts. In the first part, I want to develop a theory of the avant-garde as it pertains to ebook. And in the second part, I'm actually going to attempt to do some live demos, and hopefully the technology will be on my side. So I think the first question, obviously, to ask is, what do we mean by avant-garde? Because I think that term has a lot of different meanings to a lot of different people. And I think it's also a very deep philosophical question to ask. And whenever I have deep philosophical questions, there's one thing I turn to, and that's reality television. So I watched lots of episodes of Project Runway, and I learned that avant-garde clothing has lots of ruffles, but it didn't really help me learn more about what I was trying to approach, which was avant-garde in literature. So what do we mean by avant-garde literature specifically? And I think the famous Potter Stewart quote applies here as well, which is that it's avant-garde literature and avant-garde writing is something that you know when you see it. So I have here sort of a pastiche of some both famous and popular titles that I think can be well classified as avant-garde. So on the top left, you see The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Stern. And the top right is a really, really cool, fairly contemporary book by Jonathan Safran Foer called Tree of Codes, where he actually took a much older novel called The Street of Crocodiles, and he actually went into the book and he took that story and he cut out pieces of the pages until what was left over formed a brand new story. So it's just a really cool story in and of itself, but a rumination on negative space and the physicality of books. Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace is one of my absolute favorite books of all time, and I think it's a really, really powerful avant-garde storytelling to his use of footnotes and basically text within text within text. In the bottom center, you see another recent title called House of Leaves by Mark Danielewski. I'm going to talk a little bit more about him later on in the presentation. And also just throwing in one more thing in there, I'm a child of the 80s, and I was obsessed with choose-your-own-adventure novels as a kid. So these were stories where you'd read a couple paragraphs of text, and it would be like, what do you want to do next? And it would give you two choices, and then if you chose choice 1, you'd go to page 32, and if you chose choice 2, you go to page 45. So that, I think, is an example of popular fiction that's avant-garde. And related to that, I wanted to dispel two misconceptions that I think get lumped in with avant-garde. One is avant-garde and highbrow. Avant-garde does not equal highbrow from my perspective, although it sometimes may be highbrow. And similarly, avant-garde does not equal good, although sometimes, hopefully, it may be. When I'm talking about avant-garde, what I'm talking about specifically is avant-garde as interrogation of form, interrogation of the boundaries of the medium. So in the case of physical books, an interrogation of the actual physical book form, and in the case of ebooks, an interrogation of the ebook medium. So to explore this further, I wanted to develop 3 principles of the ebook avant-garde. So the first principle is what I'm going to call the precession of book simulacra. And I totally stole this title from Jean Baudrillard, who's a 20th and 21st century French philosopher. And he wrote a title called Simulacra and Simulations. And there was an essay in that called The Precession of Simulacra. So by precession of book simulacra, what I'm talking about is that the image precedes the reality to which it is ostensibly related. So here's a quote from Baudrillard about the difference between representation and simulation, which I think is extremely relevant when discussing ebooks and the avant-garde aspect of them. So this quote is, "Representation stems from the principle of the equivalence of the sign and of the real. Simulation, on the contrary, stems from the radical negation of the sign as value, the reversion and death sentence of every reference." So basically what he's saying here is that when you're talking about images and representation, there's the desire for the image to reflect reality. And as you move it deeper and deeper into modes of simulations, the images become wholly detached from the reality from which they were originally based. So Baudrillard developed this theory, which he calls the 4 successive phases of the image, which I think perfectly dovetails with what we've seen in the past 5 to 10 years about ebooks. So phase 1 of this, of the image, or of the ebook in this case, it is the reflection of a profound reality. So in 2007, when Amazon released the Kindle, the goal was to make something that was an ebook reader that as closely as possible reflected the experience of doing print books and reading print books. So you have e-ink to replicate the look of the printed page. It actually looks like a printed page. The screen is in this case not backlit, and the text looks very much like printing. So that's the goal being to mimic exactly the experience you would have with reading a print book. But then in 2010, the iPad came out, and we started to see a new model for doing ebook reading on touchscreen devices. And this is what I'm associating with phase 2 of Baudrillard. It masks and denatures a profound reality. So people got completely up in arms, a lot of folks, when they saw the iBooks reader and the page turn flippy animations and all that stuff. It's not real. It's not a book. Why you're mocking books? Specifically, I have an arrow on this slide here that's pointing to the stack of pages at the right. And what's really interesting here is in this version of iBooks, which is a previous version, that stack of pages never changes. It has no relation to the actual length of the content. As you turn pages to the right, it doesn't increase. If you flip backwards to the left, it doesn't increase. So that's really, it's really destroying reality, because when you're reading a print book, that stack is going to increase and decrease. And related to the sentiments that you hear from the community around what I would call phase 2 of the ebook world is a quote from Baldur Bjarnason, which Dave Kramer actually put up yesterday as well. I had it in my slide deck before as well, so I decided to leave it in, even though it's a bit redundant. And what he said is, drop caps are an affectation that mocks and parodies print's long history of bespoke illustration by mutilating the first word of a chapter. So basically what he's saying is that if you have drop caps in ebooks, you're mocking print. You're desecrating the print book. And I agree with Baldur that drop caps are sort of a pointless aesthetic affectation. But where I disagree with him is that somehow the print book is privileged and that the ebook is a desecration, that it's destroying reality. I think the other way to look at it is what Baudrillard would call moving into phase 3 of the successive phases of the images, which is that it masks the absence of a profound reality. So what you're seeing here is the new version of iBooks, the version of iBooks you see today. It's exactly like the version that you saw previously, except all the appurtenances of the book are gone. You don't see the spine on the left. You don't see the pages on the right. We're detaching from that reality that we were trying to represent before. We're now simulating it in such a way that you no longer see that. And as another example of that, I wanted to show another book by Mark Danielewski called The 50-Year Sword. This is a fixed layout book. I have the link up there if anyone wants to check it out, which is in the iBook store. It's fixed layout. And it's really interesting. He's doing great things with animation of the text and blurring the text and drawings that appear. But the part that was the most brilliant to me was that if you look at where the arrow is pointing, going down the center, there were these red lines going down. And for a second, I was like, what are those? And then I realized those are stitching. That's the stitching. And I started flipping through the book, and I noticed that every 16 pages, they had those red lines going down the center. So those were the signatures. For those folks who are familiar in the publishing community, typically books are folded up into signatures of 16, 32, 64 pages. And that's the stitching that holds the book together. So I thought, what a brilliant statement on the lack of a reality by putting that stitching in there. So I think most of us in the book community are stuck in one of these 3 successive phases of the images right now. They're either stuck in that Kindle model where they're in phase 1 and they're trying to slavishly replicate the print book, or they're in phase 2 where they're dealing with the whole notion of ebooks are destroying a profound reality of print books, or they're in phase 3 where they realize that profound reality doesn't really exist anymore, but they're still making reference to it. But phase 4 is what's next, and phase 4, Baudrillard says, is it has no relation to any reality whatsoever. It is its own pure simulacrum. So what does that look like? And I put a big question mark there because I don't have all the answers to that. But one particular ebook, it's actually an iPhone app and an iPad app that really gave me a sense of what it could look like, is a game called Device 6. And I'm calling it a game because it is sort of nominally a game, but it's also an interactive ebook. Instead of levels, it's divided into chapters, and to get to the next chapter of the book, you have to solve a series of puzzles. But what's really interesting about this book is that it's a totally planar experience. You're scrolling left and right and up and down. You can see in this particular screenshot, if you scroll up, you can get one pathway of words. If you scroll to the right, you can get another. Related, here's another screenshot where you can see the text that's just sort of spiraling around. And lastly, this is my favorite shot of the entire book. When you reach the end of the game or the ebook, there's this little button that says "The End." So I'm not going to do a spoiler alert and tell you what happens, but if you play the game and make it that far, and you hit the button "The End," you'll see what happens. So I think that's really an interesting rumination about, once you detach from the whole idea of a physical book, what you can potentially do. So that's principle 1. And principle 2 that I wanted to talk about a bit is what I'm calling the surprise of ERSATZ tactility. So when you're reading a physical book, you have a real tactile experience that's created by engaging with an actual physical object. You can feel the texture of the pages, the thickness of the pages. There's a variety of experiences. But when you're integrating with either an e-ink touchscreen or an LCD touchscreen like the iPad, your fingers are only getting one tactile experience, the feeling of pressing against glass. But what's really interesting about that is that glass is backed by a computer chip, and all means of things can happen. You don't know what's going to happen when you press. So to me, the surprise of ERSATZ tactility would be answering the question, what happens when you touch everything? And I think a book that illustrates that really well is the book Yellow Submarine, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. It came out a few years ago for the iPad. So I have a video here, I'm hoping it's going to play, of a page of this book. So you can see here, as you touch the Yellow Submarine characters, they drop into their holes and pop back out again. So if you didn't touch there, you would never know that happened. But it's just it's like a cool whack-a-mole effect. And as another illustration of this, I just happened onto this one by chance as I was reading the book. I don't even know if you know to touch there. But if you're looking at John, George, Paul, and Ringo here, if you touch the different parts of their outfit, the clothes colors change. So this obviously doesn't happen in the physical world. It wouldn't occur to you if you were touching a physical book that colors would change, things like that. So I think there's a real awesome opportunity when you're doing experimental stuff around the avant-garde to create surprise and befuddle people's expectations by what happens when they touch things. And then the last principle of the Ebook Avant-Garde that I wanted to talk about is what I'm calling narrative pliability. So going back to that Choose Your Own Adventure novel, I would call this Choose Your Own Ebook Adventure. So there's a long history in computing of interactive, text-based games and text-based fiction. But I wanted to modernize it a little bit with the example. So I pulled out another iPhone app that actually came out, I think, in July, called 80 Days, which is a game that's an adaptation of Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days. And it's really, really cool. You're reading the story, which is a fresh story. It's an adaptation. And as you're reading, you're given several different options of what happens next. So you can tap where it says, my city still wore the scars of last year's siege, as you're having a conversation with this guy, and see what the response is, and so on and so forth. But the actual gameplay or storytelling that goes about is you're traveling around the world and you're making decisions about how to spend your money and where to go. So here you're making a decision about whether you want to travel and leave Paris and go to Munich. So you have a whole lot of options about what would happen where you moved on after you went to Munich, and so on and so forth. And this last slide here shows the actual map as you're traversing the world. So each time you play the game, you have 80 days to go wherever you want across this wide landscape. So you're really inventing the narrative as you go, and it's really exciting. So that concludes the theory part of this discussion. And now I'm going to do some live demos around some avant-garde ebook development that I've been doing. I wanted to take advantage of the new EPUB widget spec to create some avant-garde EPUB widgets that anybody could use to do avant-garde ebook development. Raise your hand in here if you have an iPhone or an iPad with you right now. Great, awesome. So if you are interested to follow along with my demo, if you go to github.com/sandersk/ebook_avant_garde, you'll see an EPUB at the root level that you can download. And I'm going to walk through this on iBooks on my Mac, while you're welcome to follow along as you like. So bear with me 1 second. I need to mirror displays. This is the avant-garde ebook I created. I decided to name it Ebook Avant-Garde, which maybe is an avant-garde thing to do, or maybe not. I'm not sure. So it's written by me, but with an assist from Lewis Carroll, Herman Melville, and William Shakespeare. I created 3 avant-garde ebook widgets that I'm going to illustrate. The first one is something that I'm calling Invisible E-Ink. So I took an excerpt from the story Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And what I did is I whited out all the text. I made it invisible. And then you can either swipe with your finger, or if you're using it on a computer screen, mouse over the text to reveal the rest of the story. So you can see here, Chapter 1, Down the Rabbit Hole. As I mouse over the text, it appears. So you can do fun things like skip around, go in a circle. Maybe I can do like a smiley face. So that really is interrogating this experience of reading and the text, how it's displayed and how it's rendered, and making you an active participant in that process, and making you very self-aware of the entire act of printing. So that was one example. The second example is something I'm calling CSI EPUB. So I picked as a story for this, probably should have picked a crime story, but I really love the story Bartleby the Scrivener by Herman Melville. So I took an excerpt from that. And what I wanted to do was interrogate the whole notion of tactility about how you're touching books as you're reading them, and give you insight into that experience. So what happens with this book, if you're using it on an actual touchscreen device, when you tap on the text, fingerprints are appearing, as you can see here. Here I'm just clicking, so the experience is a little different. But you're basically seeing exactly where you're putting your imprint on the text. If I switch to night mode, I think it looks a little cooler. Looks a little bit more like a crime scene. Okay, I'll switch back to sepia. And then the very last example that I wanted to show is something that I'm calling math.random Shakespeare. So math.random is the JavaScript function for doing random numbers. So in this case, I have a story where I've taken an excerpt from Hamlet, and you click the randomize content button over and over, and you can scramble and re-scramble the lines of a famous passage. So this is a famous excerpt from Polonius's speech to Laertes, where he's giving him advice in Hamlet. And normally it goes something like this: and these few precepts in thy memory, look thou character, give thy thoughts no tongue, nor any unproportioned thought his act, etc., etc. But all you have to do to get a brand new story to make the narrative a little bit more pliable is click the randomize content button. So now we start off, for loan off lose both itself and friend, farewell my blessing sees in this in thee, and borrowing dulls the edge of husbandry. So I can click the story again and get a different result, and again. And surprisingly, as I was doing this, I thought, oh, I'll just get nonsense every time. But it gave me new insight into the passage, and it really made me look at things a bit of a different way. So what I wanted to do here is basically just illustrate a few really simple examples. All of these were written with very few lines of code. These were pretty basic to do, about ways that you can change up and mix up and do experimental things with your ebooks. So all of the code is online. There's 3 EPUB widget files that you could use to download and extract the content and put them into your own EPUBs. And you can also download this EPUB if you haven't already to just experiment and play around with this. But I'm hoping that you can use this as an opportunity to really think about as you're doing ebook development. These are just standard reflowable books that you can do really exciting, cool, avant-garde things. And really help us move into phase 4 and think further about what the next generation of ebooks looks like. So that's all I really had. I'm just going to put up my contact information. And my time's up anyway, but thank you very much.
So, question? So, Bob?
I wanted to not do something with tech books for once, so I wanted to do stuff with classic literature for this demo. Yeah. We're working on interactive stuff for Python as well. That just seemed like a different talk, so yeah.
Okay, other questions? Yeah, okay, sorry, in the back, yeah.
I have 2 comments. So the second one is Walter's reaction to our content library came up. But I think his point is not so much print versus digital as type versus illustration. He doesn't like type-based drop casts in print either. He only likes the ones that are drawn. The other comment is I noticed that the creativist tables of what is available for these EPUB readers, it doesn't include reading.
I can speak to the Balder thing. I don't know what was in his mind when he wrote that quote. So I think you may very well be right that he was talking about bespoke illustrated drop caps in print versus EPUB rather than making commentary about ebooks destroying the fabric of reality and such. However, I do feel that that's the example of the sort of thinking that I think people have, that things like drop caps and all this other stuff, oh, we're just trying to slavishly replicate print. So I hope I'm not misrepresenting him with that quote. But I think that the sentiment that underlied it, to me, did seem to be such that, ebooks are just trying to do, crappy imitations of print. Yeah, I'm just going to repeat what Liam said, which is that drop caps are not merely affectations. They have important wayfinding capabilities. They can help you navigate 2 different sections and note the importance of them. And I wouldn't disagree with that. I think that's perfectly valid.
Yeah, so the question was essentially, with all these crazy interactive things, Kindle doesn't do any of it, and Kindle is basically just a flat output, so what should you do about that? From my perspective, and this just sort of looping back into my talk, in the web world there's an idea of graceful degradation, which basically just says that you should support everything within your abilities, and that means, so for example, the book that I showed, that means that on KF8 devices, it all breaks down to just really flat text that's still well designed. And, you know, in terms of selling, I think it's going to be up to the individual publisher what actually makes sense to them. But I'm hesitant to say that we should just drop everything because of lowest common denominator. You know, you can look back at the original Mobi 7 spec, and then the day iBooks came out, like, you know, 6 months later, they were on KF8. So I think that there's something to be said about competitiveness and showing that there are other options out there that will just sort of pull along the rest of the industry. I mean, we saw that with web browsers when Firefox and WebKit came out. All of a sudden, Internet Explorer had to pick up and like do everything that was in the spec. So is that on an individual publisher to make that competitive? I don't think it is. But I do think that there is enough of us all in this room that can push things forward, and you know, when you get those one or two breakthroughs, other competitors who are not doing those things will take notice.
I can speak a little bit to the publisher perspective of that. All the examples I showed use JavaScript, obviously. A couple of them also use SVG. It's not going to work in Amazon and the Kindle. Sucks. So I think, you know, and this goes back to something that Lisa was saying yesterday in her presentation as well. Like, if this is important to you, just keep building this stuff until Amazon listens. And I also think that publishers do need to think in that mode of think projects like Device 6. Go where you can do the stuff that you want to do, and your customers will find you.
Well, and actually, during my talk, I was really trying to address that exact point, which is that for publishing houses that are very focused on profitability and sales numbers and all those kinds of things, which is normal for businesses to do, where this innovation may very well happen is, and I don't want to call it in the fringes, because teachers making things for their students is not the fringes, or corporations creating training materials for the employees is not the fringes. But we might think of it as that in the publishing world sometimes. But it's actually the meat. And in some ways, some of these, the content that we think of as the meat, a lot of people might think of as the fringes. And so I think that it may not be driven by innovation in the, you know, the big houses and in the main mega stores. It's going to be in areas other than that, and I think that's what's really key about what we were talking about today, talking about InDesign, talking about authoring tools, talking about being able to display this in the browser, because when anyone can make this content and anyone can view this content, then it begins to change the game, I really think.
Other questions?
A very down-to-earth question. The medium stuff today is bound to Chrome.
To croak?
The medium stuff today is bound to Chrome.
Oh, about Chrome.
And I don't use Chrome, so will there be or are there other versions?
Absolutely. I'll let you talk to that.
Sorry, repeat what you said.
Yeah, so the observation was that where Redium is most visible is in the Chrome extension that's on the Google web app store, which is absolutely right. And it's probably an oversight on our part to have not made clear more about the other parts of Redium. And so the Chrome extension is what most people think of when they think of Redium. But 99% of that HTML and JavaScript code, literally 99%, is applicable to a browser-based reader. And if you go into the GitHub for the Redium JavaScript viewer, which is the root project for the web-based Redium stuff, there's a grunt task that builds the Chrome extension, and there's a grunt task that builds a web reader. And there are additional problems with cross-platform, but a lot of those have been addressed, and there are really good people working very hard to make the cross-platform, cross-browser issues work.
So eventually, and we did a short eventually, there will be a Firefox extension or a Safari extension.
It's not an extension, but it is a just a web page, an index HTML with JavaScript libraries that would be appropriate to run off of a server. There are other technologies that may do something like the Chrome extension, where you could package it up and run it within the context of Firefox. I'm not aware of those. I'm sure they exist, and for other browsers too. But the one that is the sort of offline packaged form is the Chrome extension. And that has the advantage of being able to talk to the file system to store books offline, which is an incredible, nice thing. But
There is an EPUB extension for Firefox, which has the same behavior, but it's not an EPUB suite. So ideally, I would like to see that.
And that exists today. It's just like he was saying that we actually were going to show the browser version of it today, and we ended up. It was more convenient for us we weren't sure if we're going to have internet access, so we used the Chrome extension, but it is available today. It does the exact same rendering. And in fact, there's a library called Redium Share.js, and that is shared across the Chrome extension, the browser-based version, or the browser-agnostic version, as well as the software development kits for Mac OS X, Windows, iOS, and Android, all of which are very close to being reaching a 1.0 status, which is really kind of a arbitrary decision within the group. It's around 80% compliance to all the EPUB 3 specification features, but that's all going to be there. It's all on GitHub now, but and you can use it, and several companies have deployed apps with it. But it's really going to, I think, reach that sweet spot here in the next month or two.
But specifically to your point about Firefox, so if somebody has that expertise of the Chrome extension equivalent in Firefox, submit it, help us, tell us, make an issue, right?
Okay, one last question.
Everybody wants to eat.
Okay. Michelle.
This is a question for Sanders. You were focusing a lot on the question of the delivery method and in terms of its sort of function as potential simulacra. But what about the language itself, sort of fiction versus reality? I mean, is there a way in which what you're suggesting in terms of structure affects the actual relationship between the text and the real world described?
So the question is that I was focused largely on experimentation with form, and there's an equally great question around experimentation with actual written language and how that interacts with the form. I deliberately stayed away from that a little bit because I think that experimentations with language themselves aren't necessarily specific to ebooks. So you can take David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest and you can put it in ebook, and as long as you keep that relationship between the main text and the footnotes of the footnotes, you're still getting an avant-garde experience from the language. But I do think that, to take that as an example, you could do experimentation with the form that would dovetail with that experimentation of the content, where you could do things like, make the footnotes pop up and then make footnotes pop up on top of those footnotes, or to, dive down, do interesting things with how you present the location of those things. So I agree with you, definitely, that the two forms of experimentation can dovetail nicely.
Okay, so we are off to lunch. Enjoy, go feed, and we will come back. So thank you. Also, a quick thanks to Gray Area for making the internet work. We really appreciate it.